Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Biosimilars, What's New and What's Next. My name is Lilith Smith. I am the Manager of Compounding and Compliance at Baptist Health South Florida. Today, I also have the pleasure of serving as a moderator for our webinar. To start off, I'd like to thank FLASCO, the Florida Society of Clinical Oncology, for facilitating this webinar. FLASCO is a member-supported state society that focuses on providing education, timely dissemination of pertinent information, and general support of the Florida professionals who have chosen the medical discipline of oncology. I know that many of the individuals participating in this discussion are members of FLASCO, and we appreciate their support. In addition, this discussion would not be possible without our sponsors at Pfizer, and we thank them for their support. I'd like to start off by letting everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and your lines will be muted for the duration of the meeting. With that said, we encourage you to submit questions or comments via the on-screen chat feature. We will share as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion towards the end of the webinar. We've already received a number of questions from people who've commented via social media or shared questions in advance, and we're excited to have our panelists share their perspective on those topics. Our topic today is about biosimilars, and this program is specifically geared towards audiences already familiar with the topic. Biosimilars represent a unique opportunity to increase access to care for patients while still offering a safe, effective, and high-quality treatment option. I want to emphasize that our panelists have streamlined key biosimilar content to generate discussion during the Q&A portion of this webinar, and intentionally designed this program for more Q&A time at the end so as to tailor to the real-world challenges and opportunities within your practice sites. I'd now like to take a moment to introduce our two panelists. Our first panelist, who also happens to be a colleague of mine, is Dr. Jorge Garcia. Dr. Garcia is the Assistant Vice President of System Oncology Pharmacy Service Line at Baptist Health South Florida. Dr. Garcia is a FLASCO member and recognized thought leader on biosimilars. He has given numerous talks on the subject and enjoys answering questions about new developments and opportunities in this emerging area. He obtained his Doctor of Pharmacy from Nova Southeastern University and later attended the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center to pursue a combined PGY1, PGY2 Health System Administration residency. Dr. Garcia will share more about the science behind biosimilars, as well as highlighting some of the new developments and news that will be of interest to attendees. Our other esteemed panelist is Dr. John O'Brien. Dr. O'Brien is a pharmacist who most recently served as Senior Advisor to the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He's currently a Senior Fellow at the USC Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. Dr. O'Brien led policy development on multiple administration priorities, including improving the affordability and access for prescription drugs. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health Policy and a key advisor to the Secretary for Health Policy Research, Development, and Analysis related to Medicare, Medicaid, and private health insurance. Dr. O'Brien is a certified health insurance executive, was a career official at CMS during the Obama administration, and served as a health policy fellow in the U.S. Senate. Like Dr. Garcia, he also earned his Doctor of Pharmacy degree from Nova Southeastern University and also holds a master's degree in public health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. O'Brien will talk about some of the obstacles and policy aspects that are relevant to biosimilars, as well as share his perspective on how those challenges can be overcome. We are so appreciative that you've carved out the time to be with us today. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Garcia to share his remarks.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Lilette. It's great to be with you all today. Thank you for making time for today's discussion. I have a few objectives for today. We will spend the bulk of our time talking about industry barriers and opportunities ahead. So we know that biologics have revolutionized the treatment options for conditions in healthcare. In 1970, biologics pretty much consisted of vaccines and blood products, and they were only about 10% of the pharmaceutical market. By 1980, with cloning technology and gene expression technology, we were able to have biosynthesis of genetically modified organisms, which allow for more complex molecules to be produced. And by 1982, we had Genentech's recombinant human insulin. And by 86, the FDA approved the monoclonal antibody, the first of that kind. By 97, we had recombinant monoclonal antibodies in the space of cancer. Now, with those treatment options, we also have the cost of biopharmaceuticals reach an all-time high. In the decade of 2005 to 2014, CMS Part B spend doubled from 32% to 62%. And by 2017, more than 208 biologic products were already registered, at that point already accounting for a market that was more than 25% of the spend for CMS. Now, we know that the cost of pharmaceuticals is a major key concern and that is unsustainable, and it continues to grow. When we look at biologics that will be losing patent exclusivity soon, we're looking at a 20 billion global annual spend, so that does give us enough of an opportunity to have an impact. The majority of those biologics that will be losing patent exclusivity, we expect that the biosimilars will gain the majority of that market share. And so for that reason, we are seeing also innovative companies pursue biosimilar development. And so if we look 30 years ago when we had generics introduced in the market, we had a similar scenario that we're seeing today with biosimilars. However, biosimilars are different and do not fit the same regulatory approval pathway that we have for generics. I know this audience is familiar with the definition of biosimilars, but just to highlight the main points, we know that it's not, a biosimilar is not chemically identical, but it's highly similar to an approved biologic, and notwithstanding minor differences in terms of safety and efficacy, and those are proven to not be clinically meaningful. Now, because biosimilars are inherently different, we had to develop a new approval pathway here in the US. And so in 2009, the Public Health Service Act was modified to include the 351K pathway. And what that did is it allowed an abbreviated pathway of approval to demonstrate biosimilarity or interchangeability. And I think what's key to understand here is that the goal of the 351K pathway was not to reestablish safety or efficacy. That was already done by the originator company. And so the goal here is just to demonstrate that the product is highly similar. And I know this audience is familiar with this landmark slide for biosimilar presentations. The one point I want to make here is that analytical studies become very relevant and important for the biosimilar development process. They devote a great deal of time looking at the physical characteristics of the biosimilar molecule in comparison to the reference product. But also there's preclinical and PK, PD, those being pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, and immunogenicity studies. And I think sometimes this is an area of misconception because some providers or other clinicians may not fully understand that there is always those clinical studies done as part of any biosimilar development program. So it's a good area for us to intervene and clarify that. Now, phase 3 clinical trials are not mandatory, and many times there is sufficient evidence for the FDA based on those PK/PD and immunogenicity studies to approve the product. That's definitely the trend that we've seen here in the US. Other studies could be requested by the FDA as needed, or the sponsor may decide to go ahead and do those studies anyways. Now, I want to focus the rest of my part of the presentation on barriers of entry. And last year, the advisory board, which is a consulting group that identifies best practices and shares that with healthcare executives, did a national webinar and a poll around biosimilars and the main challenges and barriers that practices were facing. So as you could see here, the top 3 were reimbursement, provider reluctance. To me, this is very similar to the need for education. and also operational changes. And you could see that the distribution is pretty similar among the top three barriers that biosimilars face today. Now, I won't have time to go into the details, but my goal here is just to generate more discussions. Towards the Q&A, I'll just touch on a few things with regards to barriers to entry. When it comes to education, my primary goal is to make sure we understand that education means different things for different stakeholders. Definitely, we as a health system or provider need to have an internal and an external education plan. And that, of course, includes the patients. It also includes other peer professionals, sort of like in the setting that we're doing right now. But I think one important stakeholder that oftentimes gets forgotten is the public. And again, drug cost in the US is a key public concern. And I think it's important we include the public. A few ways that we can help educate is obviously through the literature. And to the right here, I am sharing a unique experience that I had to actually come on a TV show at PBS, the Health Channel program, for a full hour to help educate the public on biosimilars. And that's important for many reasons. I think we should be cognizant that, especially in oncology, which tends to be a disease of the elderly, many times the patients are not the primary or the only decision maker of the care. So making sure their family members and others are well educated on biosimilars is really key to make sure that they get used appropriately. Now, in terms of another major barrier of entry, implementation at the different sites, it's key. And you may have seen a big lag of time between P&T approval, the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee approval, or if you are in a smaller practice, just the clinical review and basically the actual implementation of the products. And you know, one of the main barriers to that is the mobilization of different resources and teams that is necessary to be able to successfully bring a new biosimilar on board. You could see some of the common stakeholders here as the providers, the pharmacy, the nursing team, all the way to the top left there is informatics. And that tends to be a big area. Those teams are usually overwhelmed with different projects, and it's difficult to prioritize the biosimilar go live. And you could see many other teams mentioned here. What's key is that sometimes that team may help you bring a biosimilar live at one hospital, one facility, or even just one section, just the inpatient, because the outpatient team may be a whole different group of providers or nursing. It may be a different pharmacy dispensing the product. So definitely this is a key area of focus for health system providers. Now, I did want to take a couple of minutes to share with you guys a best practice that we've implemented in our facility around the selection of the biosimilar. This is one of the areas that I see other health systems and providers struggle with. And I see that a lot of times they put a lot of pressure and expectations on the provider to order the right product, and that creates many challenges down the line. So to go through this graph, I would like to describe first the previous process that we had in place on the left, and then I'll describe the current process. So previously, our providers were to order the product that was to be used. So in the pegfilgrastim space, for example, if they wanted to have the Onpro, they would be expected to order that product specifically. And then our authorizations team, part of our business office, will go ahead and always try to pursue authorization for whatever product the provider ordered. The business office, of course, many times would encounter challenges with the specific product not being approved by the patient's plan. And at that point, they needed to reach out back to the provider to let them know that that product was not approved, and they needed to go back to the treatment plan and re-enter a different product. Now, this was frustrating for the providers because they didn't want to be involved with those logistical steps. The business office was frustrated because they had to issue sometimes multiple phone calls. A lot of times they would not get the providers to switch that product to what the health plan was paying in a timely manner. And sometimes we would have the patient in the chair ready to receive treatment, and we still would not have the right order. So pharmacy would have to intervene last minute, try to make last minute phone calls, and it just puts our entire team in a very uncomfortable position, and obviously it could potentially delay the care of the patient as well. So to work through those barriers, we implemented a new process, and that consists on just having the providers put in a generic product, not pointing specifically to any one item. So in this particular example, it will be pegfilgrastim, and that wouldn't point necessarily to either of the two reference product options or any of the several biosimilar options in the pegfilgrastim space. So then our business office would have the flexibility to pursue authorization for the product that we prefer as a facility. And that is information that is provided to the business office based on previous P&T determination. And only when the business office is unable to get an authorization for our preferred product do they tailor to the product that the health plan covers. And so at that point, once they have an authorization, that's documented in the system, and pharmacy at point of order review can see what that authorization is for. And in the product selection, the pharmacy is able to select the right product for dispensation. Now, that only has to be done the first time or the first cycle. Once we change that product, that populates for future cycles. So pharmacy has to do that product assignment only once. But this has been really transformational in terms of our efficiencies. It really has been a satisfier for the business office because they don't have to be calling anyone. They just have to document it in the system. The providers are very happy with the process because no one is reaching out to them to tell them to change to different products, nor is the expectation up front for the provider that they order some products because we as a facility prefer them, but to then tell them that there are exceptions if patients are on certain health plans, that they need to order different products. That's just basically a process that it's not going to go on to be successful. And so we've had great success there, and just wanted to share with you. It also did two other things for us. It allowed pharmacy to be in a lead role. We're not relying on providers or other to be able to order the biosimilars. We're able, through an automatic substitution, we're able to have a lead role there and make that happen ourselves. And also it positioned our service for success, understanding that we will have a lot more biosimilar options or even different options of the brand name in the future. So it allows our team to tailor to the specific approval that that patient has. Now, in the next few slides, I would like to talk to you about barriers to the biosimilar market in general. I think as providers, we're pretty familiar with the barriers that we face once the biosimilars are FDA approved and available in the market. However, there are barriers preventing the biosimilars to come to the market. And I think those are relevant. And I think if we want to sustain a long-term, well-balanced pharmacoeconomic model for biosimilars, we need to pay more attention to those things and work together for a more fair marketplace. So patent litigation, you may also see this documented in the literature as a patent dance. It's an issue that's been holding biosimilars back, especially here in our country with the way the patent law is. Now, we know that biologics do have exclusivity, and that's 12 years. But I have been learning that patents come in many different ways. Obviously, every biologic has the main molecule patent, but they also have additional patents in terms of formulations, delivery systems. We obviously can think of Onpro there, but also absorption and others. And these patents can extend the exclusivity period for biosimilars for years. They also allow more area for infringement litigation, and that could be a time-consuming process that may just delay the launch of the biosimilars. So according to the literature, this has impacted biosimilars by months, sometimes by years. And I wanted to put this into perspective to you because I know that patent litigations is not a new concept, and I know you understand it is a barrier. But through this case, I wanted to paint the picture a little bit better so we understand all that is at stake. So looking at brand name reference product adalimumab produced by AbbVie, this is one of the highest cost biologics in the world. We're looking at a $20 billion in global sales in the year 2018. And this product would have lost exclusivity period here in the US by 2016. However, more than 247 patents have been requested, most of which were actually issued. 89% of those came after the product was launched, and about 50% of those came after the first patent had actually expired. Now, today, as of yesterday that I checked on the FDA website, we have 5 adalimumab development programs fully completed and fully approved by the FDA. However, we will not see any of those adalimumab biosimilar options appear here in the US market until 2023 and potentially beyond that date. So just to note that adalimumab biosimilars have been available in Europe since October of 2018. So I guess my point here is there is a lot of questions around the true intent of the US patent law, and we all understand why that exclusivity period of 12 years is necessary to help innovator companies continue to develop research. And I definitely not arguing that that is the right thing to do. But in this case here, we have an additional 7 years of added exclusivity, not allowing biosimilar competition in the market when the products are already developed, fully approved. And so it's holding us back. When you look at the literature, the financial impact of these delays can add up to $7.5 billion in our country since 2015 that we began our journey with biosimilar options here in the US. Now, there's more to this case. AbbVie has 2 new products that I have listed here, risankizumab being one of them. This product is showing improved effectiveness in psoriasis, and also it has a more favorable dosing schedule. These 2 products, I should say, are comparable to adalimumab in terms of the indications that they're approved for. They also have a comparable product that is an oral medication, upadacitinib, and this medication actually is showing improved efficacy for RA. And there is 21 active clinical trials listed on clinicaltrials.gov for this product specifically. So the point that I want to make here is AbbVie has exclusivity for adalimumab till 2023. In the meantime, they have these 2 other products that are already showing better effectiveness and other benefits, like better dosing schedules. So by 2023, it is possible that these new medications may become the new standard of care. And of course, we have already spent a lot of resources trying to develop all of these biosimilars. That the developers have already incurred the expenses, and they're really truthfully on standby to be able to produce these products. But when they may be allowed to enter the market, at that point, the utilization for adalimumab itself may have decreased or shifted altogether. And I shared this to demonstrate the level of risk that pharmaceutical companies bear when they do decide to come into the market, when they really don't have market exclusivity for their biosimilars, nor do they know how many competitors will come into that market to pursue exactly the same product. We also know that there is reference product innovation, which is great. I think the Onpro is an example we all think about, but also for rituximab and trastuzumab, we have sub-Q formulations. And as healthcare professionals, as we increase our comfort level with the sub-Q formulation of these products, those products may still retain a significant amount of the market share where there are biosimilar options. and the ASPs of these products may be attractive to some practices as well. So they'll probably continue to play a role. In terms of market risk and this very dynamic environment that I am describing, we see that biosimilar developers are sometimes halfway through the program. So after they have decided to pursue some of these biosimilar options, they have dropped the development altogether. We see Pfizer has dropped a number of programs in the past, and so has Momenta, adalimumab being one of them. So perhaps due to the dynamics that we just discussed, but also Merck and Amgen, infliximab is one specific case. And I quote from the reference that I read, that was due to a change in product strategy. And we know that infliximab has been a biosimilar that has been very difficult to market here in the US. Now, I want to talk and finish my part of the section a little bit on the positive note of things. Biosimilars do present us with very unique opportunities. Value-based care, it's one of those. And we know that reimbursement models, as we know them today, are not sustainable long-term. The models in the ambulatory setting today really incentivize more utilization rather than better quality of care. And so we know that all of that is in evolution. Biosimilars are uniquely positioned to perform under these models. If we look at the right side of the slide here, we see that they help us reduce cost, the quality remains the same. And by now, 5 years later, we are beginning to get evidence here in the US that they do improve access. There's some breast studies that show that here in the US. And with added access, there is potentially clinical outcome benefits too. Europe has a lot of positive information with regards to biosimilars increasing access and clinical outcomes. And again, we're very excited that we're beginning to see that here in the US as well. Now, CMS, as a major imperative of trying to mitigate the increasing healthcare cost, they have launched the OCM model. I know all of you are familiar with it. I just want to highlight that as a pharmacy leader, when you participate in OCM, you get a report at the end of each performance period, comparing your drug utilization with similar OCM practices. And if the other practices all shift and go with biosimilars and you do not do that in your practice, then you become an outlier in terms of your drug expense. And that would not be good for the overall CMS reimbursement to that specific practice. So I think OCM practices tend to be early adopters of biosimilars for that purpose. But also beyond CMS, when we look more at the commercial side, we know that we are evolving to alternative payment models there too. And there are some commercial plans that have OCM-like value programs. But if we look at this line here as a continuum, we see that in the ambulatory space, a lot of our reimbursement still fee-for-service based. However, we begin to see more programs that are shared savings, bundle payments, and OCM. It's sort of like a blend, fits in those two buckets there. But also we anticipate more of partial capitation and full risk. And definitely more provider networks are joining accountable care organizations that do call for cost containment strategies so that they can meet their performance metrics. Now, when we look at health systems like UPMC, I had the opportunity to train there for residency, so they come to mind, but also Highmark and Allegheny, also in the Pittsburgh area, or perhaps a Kaiser that we can all relate to their healthcare model. We can see that the health plan remains within the organization, so the benefit of utilizing biosimilars and keeping costs low for both the health system and the health plan is a benefit that is fully retained by the organization. So for those reasons, these types of organizations tend to be also early adopters. But I think the biggest opportunity yet is with organizations that play a role in designing the benefits for their employees. And so a couple of times when I have presented this slide, I've gotten feedback or questions from the audience about full risk or capitation, and that being something more of the future. However, if an employer manages the life of an employee, they are kind of like at full risk. So when they do their benefit designs, they can really benefit from having a biosimilar strategy. So I just wanted us to be cognizant that employers are the number one purchasers of health insurance, and they do have a limited understanding on the opportunities and risks. We can help educate and influence. I think in the last 10 years or so, we have made a lot of progress helping our employers understand why we need to have access to a specialty medication when we have those contracts with managed care. We need to begin to have the same discussion in the realm of biosimilars. And I wanted to just give you another case here to help understand what happens to overall cost of care when we have different approaches from payers. And my colleague, Dr. John O'Brien, is going to go into more details on the payer landscape. I just want to cover this case. Looking at both programs dispensing the same drug, right? So drug A, starting with the United case on the right, on the left side of the screen, we can see that under arrangements, that plan may get a rebate to be able to favorably position a brand name product. And as a result, providers in the practice, they will not be able to exercise the cost savings for that drug, as they would have to dispense the premium product. Now we'll come back to the United Healthcare. Let's go into Aetna. Aetna has taken an approach that's more so supporting the biosimilar and a parity approach in many cases. And so they are not benefiting from that upfront rebate. They are just allowing the practice to decide which biosimilars and be able to source the product. And that's really key, very important for providers. Behaves a lot like the generic market where no health plan tells me which generic to use. I sort of like source that according to how it adds more value to me. So this approach tends to be very well received by providers. And now looking at the bottom of the slide here, the benefit back to Aetna is that when I send a bill to Aetna, I am billing them for the biosimilar. And because the biosimilar has a lower ASP, my charge at the institutional setter is a markup of that ASP. I am giving Aetna a charge that is lower for the biosimilar compared to what the charge would have been if I was billing them for the brand name. Now, at the same time, going back to the United case, they do get an upfront rebate, but I, as a practice, have to then send them a bill for the brand name medication reference product that's going to have a higher ASP, is going to have a higher hospital charge, and in turn, they're going to end up paying me more. So when we look at what it does at the end, you know, the model with United is increasing overall cost of care, and the Aetna is not only decreasing the cost of care, but is providing the providers and the patients with options, which is really important and critical here. I'm on the tail end of my part here. I just wanted to remind everyone that today we sit in a completely different vantage point in terms of the safety of biosimilars compared to when the filgrastim biosimilar came to market 5 years ago, when we had no previous safety data here in the US. So the 5 years that we have of surveillance here really is a testament to the biosimilar performance in terms of safety and efficacy. And every day that passes by is an added degree of confidence that we can have similar expectations of these products from a safety and efficacy standpoint. And I think we should make that better understood. We are seeing that biosimilars is now shifting to having a lot more options. And so on the provider side, we're trying to understand how are we going to position our practices for success and to reevaluate the different options that exist. I think biosimilar portfolio is something that sounds very attractive, and a portfolio doesn't have to consist of biosimilars only. Some of the companies that produce biosimilars also produce other generic companies. And so I think this is exciting from a contracting standpoint. For those of us that have facilities with 340B and GPO, I think for biosimilars that are used both on the inpatient and the outpatient side, it gives us a lot of opportunities to get creative with contracts. Biosimilars continue to be a very volatile market, and for me as a pharmacy leader, it's really important that I develop a relationship with the producers of biosimilars that allows us to balance that market as the market continues to be competitive and price do fluctuate. So I tend to want to work with individuals that have a proven record of contracting success and someone that could be a true partner to sustain the biosimilar that you choose in your practice long term. It's very difficult for us in our side to justify to our different teams, nursing, physicians, pharmacy, to be changing biosimilars every so often. And we know that the market is very volatile. So with that, I am coming to some summary here before we have the Q&A. So we know that the sustainability of healthcare financing is a key public concern. Biosimilars do bring a very promising value proposition to help us address this. Unfortunately, they still face many barriers to both market entry and also having a model that is more sustainable, something like what we have a shift with the generic drugs. We still have a lot of work to do there. So as stakeholders, we have to come together to work through those implementation barriers and to make sure we give the biosimilar industry the very best shot to survival first, and then to long-term success and sustainability later. And with that, I'll get back to our moderator, Dr. Lillette Smith.
Thank you for sharing your insights, Dr. Garcia. I think that'll transition over really well for the policy portion of our webinar. I'd just like to remind all attendees that if Dr. Garcia's comments sparked any new questions or comments you'd like to share, you're welcome to type them into the chat, and I'll read as many as we can during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. I'll now turn it over to Dr. O'Brien to share his perspective on the policy side of biosimilars.
Anybody else having difficulties hearing Dr. O'Brien?
Yeah, thanks, Jorge, and thanks, Lillette, for a fantastic presentation about the biosimilars landscape. It's a real treat for me to be back home in Florida. I know you had a goal of trying to get to the Q&A quickly, so I'll try to be very brief in my remarks. When I worked for the President and Secretary Azar for the last 3 years, we wanted to protect a competitive marketplace that rewards innovation. But that marketplace depends on competition, and increasing competition was one of the key pillars of the President's drug pricing blueprint. Quite simply, if these reforms fail, we open ourselves up to policies that I believe will threaten the incentive to innovate and deprive American patients of new cures. And one of the most important aspects of that blueprint was building and maintaining a robust biosimilars marketplace. As Jorge shared with you, biosimilars have the potential to deliver quality care at significant savings to American patients and the healthcare system as a whole. But we're now 10 years since the creation of the biosimilars pathway, and we aren't seeing the savings predicted by the Congressional Budget Office. We want a competitive market where negotiators are incentivized to choose the lowest cost options. We did this with generics, and generics can translate into serious savings for patients. But biologics today are about 40% of prescription drug spending. So there's a real challenge, but the potential for competition and savings is huge. Imagine doing to 40% of the pharmaceutical market what we've done to the other 60. But in order to build on that success and create a biosimilar marketplace, the US healthcare system needs to adapt its payment systems to allow for new competition and get some of the regulatory barriers out of the way. Now, there's a few reasons that haven't happened. I'm just going to cover a couple of them now. But here are some things that I see as problems and things that we can do to solve them. The first are the perverse incentives in the reimbursement system. In Medicare Part B, the reimbursement of medical benefit drugs that are infused or administered in the physician's office or clinics. The doctor buys the drug and is reimbursed at the average sales price plus 6%. If they can acquire the drug at a lower price, they keep the difference. Now, every physician I've talked to and every practice I've met has said that drugs aren't a profit center for them, but they all speak up when CMS tries to change Part B reimbursement. Simply stated, if doctors get higher payments and larger profits for choosing higher priced drugs, then the system is functioning exactly the way it was intended to work. So we need payment reforms necessary to unleash significant savings opportunities from biosimilars. For example, allowing physicians to share in the savings so that they can help us harness the potential from biosimilars and bring these competitive forces to bear with increased utilization of lower cost biosimilars. Imagine if physicians or the practices that you work in were able to keep 50, 60, or 70% of the difference between the brand and the biosimilar. A shared savings model such as this would offer not only the potential for significant savings to Medicare and patients, but also valuable assistance to the biosimilars market, which you've already heard is important to sustain. Prescribing patterns will also likely change significantly if incentives for biosimilars are established. And this would jumpstart and even further the use of biosimilars that we know is important. The shared savings model would also align the incentives of the physician with the objective of Medicare and the many pharmacy directors on today's call to reduce unnecessary spending. Now, unfortunately, these perverse incentives also exist at the health plan or PBM level through the use of rebate traps or rebate walls. Now, Jorge, I hope Aetna is still doing the same thing since they were bought by CVS, but I'm not entirely sure that that's the case. But simply stated, PBMs extract rebates from drug companies, and they can use those rebates in any way they want. They can spread them across the premium. Plans can use them for supplemental benefits. But at the end of the day, some drug companies trying to protect market share against biosimilar competition will not only offer these kickbacks to insurers to keep their product on formulary, they'll also threaten to take away discounts on other products if the plan prefers a biosimilar to their brand name biologic. Even if a biosimilar is available at a lower cost, if the plan can't convince doctors to use it, then they may also lose a discount on the brand name drug that they still have to pay for. Now, I read a lawsuit last year where a pharmacy director for a health plan said, I can't afford to use the biosimilar even if they gave it to me for free. This kind of behavior is penny wise and pound foolish. Not only do rebates inflate list prices, which ultimately hurt patients, it threatens the development of a biosimilars market and puts future savings at risk. I believe reforms to the rebate system are coming, but the ultimate goal is pharmacy level interchangeability for biosimilars so that pharmacists can switch patients the same way they do generics. And I know this is a real goal for the FDA, who's working very hard to that end. The third reason is quite simply anti-competitive behavior. Many brand companies have built patent thickets or complicated patents around not just the product, but their production methods that often require years of litigation before an approved biosimilar can be successfully marketed. There are billions of dollars of savings tied up in patent litigation as we speak. And sometimes these lawsuits are settled with pay for delay agreements or an agreement to settle litigation with an exclusive right to market a product, but only after many additional years of market exclusivity for the brand name biologic. A popular health policy publication just today noted that the tiny country of Denmark was able to switch 95% of the market share for the drug that Jorge covered in his case study to the biosimilar. In the United States, we won't see a biosimilar until I think it's 2024, maybe Q3 of 2023. But we won't see a biosimilar for many years. And America's seniors and the Medicare program will suffer. And just to put that into context, $20 billion, that's an aircraft carrier. So we're losing significant opportunities in federal spending on other important programs because of the excess that the Medicare program is spending. Now, these arrangements are legal. And the point I'm trying to make is that there's what's legal and there's what's right. Because if drug spending keeps going the way that it does, and the perverse incentives continue to exist, and these sort of shenanigans are continued to practice, it will give credence to some of the arguments that others are using to try to blow up the pro-competitive system that we have, and that has the potential to really threaten innovation. Another anti-competitive behavior is when drug companies or those with whom they work try to scare doctors into believing that biosimilars are unsafe or have unproven efficacy. To quote Secretary Azar, those trying to hold back biosimilars with disinformation are, quite simply, on the wrong side of history. The FDA and the Federal Trade Commission are now working closely to investigate these and other anti-competitive behaviors, and I suspect that there will be consequences for those behaving badly. We know it's possible to get patients and providers on board with interchangeable options. We did it in the 80s and the 90s with generics. We can do the same for biosimilars. At HHS and other federal agencies with jurisdiction, they are determined to make some of the major steps towards that goal occur under this administration. And that's why webinars like this, in the interest of all of you, are so important. So I want to thank FLASCO again for having me and everyone on today's call for your time and your interest today, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for updating us on the latest issues and developments regarding the policy aspects of biosimilars, Dr. O'Brien. We are now in the Q&A portion of this webinar. I received a number of questions, but you haven't submitted one yet. I'd ask you to do so using the on-screen chat feature. I'll read the questions, and then our panelists can decide who answers each question first. We'll continue to ask questions until our time has run out. So we're going to start off with the first question. Can you please discuss the impact of biosimilar products entering the market on the pricing of the reference product?
Absolutely happy to. I'm glad that this question came our way, actually. So we see that before there is a biosimilar option, almost invariably, there is very consistent price increases year to year. That could be, for example, for some products, a 10% increase. So when you spread that over a decade, you could have more than 100% price increase for some of the products. That could be pretty significant. Along the way there, when it is known that there is biosimilar activity going on, you may see even a bump in the price of the reference product because they know competition is coming on the way. And so what biosimilars do first to begin with is they flatten the curve. And I know we're very familiar with that term now after COVID-19. But basically, instead of continuing to have that very steady increase, biosimilars come to market, and that reference product is at least flattening the curve compared to the rate of increase before. But what we are actually seeing is that in some instances, it can also lead to lower costs, lower prices. In the case of infliximab, as an example, one source that I came across described the 30% discount of the brand name product. And this is expected. It's what market competition should be about. Now, we do not expect to see those prices settled over a short period of time. If you look at literature from Europe, they're saying that for them to reach the best discounts in some biosimilars, it's taken about 10 years in some instances. And their system is less convoluted. Here in our system, with the payers, the dynamics of the payers, and other things, I think it may take even more than 10 years for us to really see and settle discounts that are sustainable for the market, where biosimilar pharmaceutical companies can still produce the biosimilars in a viable way.
Yeah, I'm going to come at that a little bit differently. I think, unfortunately, what happens when the price flattens is that just maintains the price of the innovator product at its current high price and just forces larger rebating to providers and payers, which then serves as a barrier because they would rather receive the higher reimbursement for the higher priced product. I believe the experience of Denmark and elsewhere in the EU shows that you can turn biosimilar programs on a dime. And I think key to that is getting the perverse incentives out of the way. And that's why I'm a fan of the shared savings pathway, separate for drugs and outside of accountable care organizations, because quite simply drug spending or biologic spending can be such a small portion of an overall ACO's target that the ability to drill down and focus specifically on drugs is, I think, a way to really help shift provider behavior. There was a great paper written by Alex Brill just this week about that topic, and I know I've shared that with FLASCO, so they can share that with others.
Yeah, so definitely, John, great points there. I think in areas like oncology, per OCM data, we know that drugs account for more than 50% of the overall total expense. So there's a lot of attention on drug cost. I think it's really important to understand what are the goals of an organization, a healthcare organization that is, and what type of value they want to drive with biosimilar implementation. Just like there is ASP revenue implications. I think even before COVID, the journey of cost containment was of high interest to healthcare executives to position the organization for success. And when we do managed care contracts, they're highly interested in partnering with low cost care providers. And if you achieve that, they are willing to drive volumes to you via the benefits as a preferred provider. And so I think, sometimes the way I manage that conversation is, are we in this for the business as we know it today, or do we want to develop the muscle and the ability to learn how to perform on the payment models that are of the future? And biosimilars are kind of like a nice way to get there, because you're not fully changing everything. We have still new drugs that come out with very healthy ASPs and manage, allow us to keep control of the revenue that way. But it allows us to also exercise and develop the efficiencies to prepare for the future and be able to perform under value base for some of us, OCM, and so on. So it definitely is a continuum.
Thank you for that, Dr. Garcia. So our next question is, can you discuss switching between reference drug and biosimilar, and if there is likely to be an impact on therapeutic effect?
Absolutely. I think the participant really touched on the question that they know there's very limited data on this, and I think that's right. When I first became interested in biosimilars, I would just go to Starbucks and do a PubMed search just with biosimilars, and I found abundant information on actually switching. I think that's the most types of studies that you will find there when you try to look up biosimilars. However, those studies do have many design limitations. Some of them are not randomized. They may lack a control arm. There may be no PK/PD test before the switches and after the switches, and some of them would just be insufficiently powered to even detect the difference. Having said that, every single study that I have seen for interchangeability invariably have not pointed towards a difference when a patient is switched from one to the other. But the caveat is maybe the study was just not designed to be able to detect the difference. So for that reason, the FDA has not deemed any of that evidence good to be able to support interchangeability of biosimilars. And to date, the FDA has not deemed any biosimilars interchangeable. However, they did publish a finalized interchangeability guideline. This one does call for a three-way switch, keeping one arm on change. And these types of studies require more investment, and biosimilars are about keeping the cost down. So I don't know how the sponsors will respond to this, and if they will pursue this interchangeability status. Perhaps that may make more sense for products that are injectables and may be dispensed out of Part D, just to provide the pharmacies with the flexibility to interchange. But outside of that, we have already developed these systems to, at the institutional level, be able to switch these products even though there's no interchangeability. And the way payers are treating biosimilars without an FDA designation, they are already, in a way, treating them as interchangeable, because they're telling me you cannot use this product, you have to use this other product. And so it will be interesting to see where the market takes that. But I would tell you that the studies that sponsors have brought to the FDA for approval, many of them do have a design whether they go back and forth between the reference product and the proposed biosimilar. And when they demonstrate biosimilarity in terms of PK and PD, they show that even though they're switching the patients, the outcomes are still similar. So I think that there is some degree of confidence that could come out of that. The other thing I would say is now we have 5 years of real world evidence of patients being switched, right? So we did it because our practices decided to implement, or the payers have just told us you have to switch all of these patients. John mentioned earlier, I hope Aetna is still doing the same thing. I hope so too, because they change their mind every quarter. And we know we've lived through health plans having a policy that calls for being on product A one quarter, and the next quarter they change their mind and then bring us to product B, and we have to switch all of our patients. So that information is out there. It will be great if we can get to it retrospectively and try to correlate whether those patients that were impacted by payer switches went on to have any differences in outcomes. And retrospective type of analysis tend to be less costly compared to prospective. So maybe that's an avenue there that we can pursue. But I guess to finalize here, more robust studies are needed if we want to fully validate that interchanging and switching patients is not going to have any impact in terms of safety and efficacy.
Thank you. So our next question, the COVID-19 health crisis has put a significant strain on state budgets. Can you speak to the role biosimilars could play in helping save local and state governments money, and what steps should policymakers be thinking about?
Well, I think there's a number of ways to look at that question. Obviously, one of the real fears is that we're going to see people leaving the commercial employer-sponsored marketplace and going over into Medicaid and exchange coverage. I would say, though, that the ability for biosimilars to demonstrate savings is a payer-agnostic one. And the importance of having reimbursement policies at dominant payers to create the momentum to reward physicians to help save the system money is the most important thing that policymakers should be considering. So I do hope that Medicare will lead there. Obviously, CMS gives states the flexibility to design the program as they see fit. And to the extent that states pursue responsible reimbursement policies, there's upside in that. If managed Medicaid or organizations choose to go the way with contracting as they so often have with other rebate decisions, then the consequences might not be what we want to see.
And I would just add that when we look at government payment for biosimilars, looking at CMS as an example, it's based on product ASP. So when we utilize a biosimilar, that ASP is generally lower. We have seen that first, when closer to 2016, 2015, a 15 to 20% discount across the board. That's looking more closer to 30% today. And we know that as our biosimilar market matures further, those discounts are probably going to be steeper. Definitely in Europe, they're a lot steeper. In some instances, 55% more, but that market is more mature. So the government payment to us as providers on biosimilars is directly impacted by paying us a lower ASP. This is something that they update on a quarterly basis, so they exercise a direct benefit there. And obviously, there is so many other ways to slice this, but the VA gets special pricing, and they're able to exercise additional cost savings with biosimilars in that space as well.
Great. Thank you. So some providers have expressed a concern that it's difficult to stay up to date with every insurance preference related to biosimilars. It can also be challenging to adjust pharmacy formularies and organization procedures to comply with these policies. Do you see any policy solutions or other opportunities on the horizon to alleviate those concerns?
Sure. I think that gets to the importance of interchangeability. I think Jorge spoke at great length about how important it is for policies to be brand agnostic when specific to the molecular level. I think this is going to become even more important as we start to see more and more biosimilars marketed for drugs in Part D. The way rebates work is a manufacturer wants market share, and the only way that I'm going to give you additional rebate is if you're able to move market share. So if a plan decides I'm going to now start covering the biosimilar, and the biosimilar manufacturer is not able to shift the share, because the providers are dug in, or the providers like the additional reimbursement that they're getting from the brand biologic, then it's going to put the payer in the unenviable position of not only losing a discount, but having to pay a higher price for a drug that they still have to pay for. So I think interchangeability becomes incredibly important as we start to move to Medicare Part D. There are also other important tools. At CMS, we were real advocates for a real-time benefit tool. I know many private health plans are doing that as well. It allows the physician and the pharmacist at the time of prescribing to be able to see what products are covered, what the patient out-of-pocket for each is, and what the savings opportunities are, as opposed to having to try to make that decision in an infusion clinic chair when it's too late to do so.
Thank you. So this is going to be our last question. Um, Protecting the ASP for biosimilars is very difficult. What recommendations do you have to protect the ASP today?
Well, I guess, we have to understand that there is value beyond ASP for practices. So when we determine to partner with a pharmaceutical company for a product, there are so many other things that we need to evaluate. The drug supply, consistency of that supply, their patient assistance, if you have a significant amount of indigent patients. So just like we don't go for the cheapest generic out there, but I think as providers, we need to do due diligence to make sure that we support the biosimilar that is providing the most value to the practice and the patient. And by doing that, we will be preserving the ASP.
Yeah, and more importantly than that, the ability to shift from pay for volume to pay for value, and get into more of a cap model where it behooves me as a practice to use a lower acquisition cost product and not worry about the spread between what I acquired and what I'm being reimbursed. I think that's so true in so many aspects of the healthcare system, but nowhere is it more true than in medical benefit biologics.
Thank you. That was our final question. I'd like to again thank Dr. Garcia and Dr. O'Brien for taking the time to share their expertise with us. This has been an enlightening and engaging presentation, and I think we've all walked away with something new. This webinar was recorded, so if you missed something and want to hear it again, it will be available on the FLASCO website in the next coming days. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.